We going to have scripture?
Yes. For the next 4 Sundays, I want us to think together under the general topic of some things to remember. Some things to remember. It's important for several reasons that we be able to remember. Now, I want you to understand this morning, I'm not trying to bring any new or novel word in these next 4 Sundays together. I used to try that as a young preacher, to have something new and novel to say. I'd spent a lot of time at it. I'd work hard at finding an unusual topic or an unusual text for preaching. I'd forage around back there in the Old Testament, you know, the books of Nahum and Habakkuk, the ones you can't find no matter how hard you search. I'd say to myself, I gotta have something that nobody else has ever said, something my predecessors had never preached about. I bet they never said this. And what I was doing, of course, was competing with my predecessors, trying to prove myself better than them as a young minister, and that's pretty vain. Stupid. You don't have to tell me by your laughter that was obnoxious. But at the time I thought there was something inherently advantageous to being novel. So I would say to myself, oh boy, I bet they never heard this. And sure enough, I was right. They had never heard it. And what's more, they really didn't want to hear it. I think maybe I've matured beyond those impulses. So I'm not trying to say anything new or novel in the next 4 Sundays as I preach the next 4 sermons under the general title, Some Things to Remember. And another reason that I chose this title for these 4 sermons is that I want to honor what you already know. Many of you have been Christians much longer than I have, and I want to honor that, and thereby call to your recollection what you already know. Another reason I think this is an important topic, some things to remember, would cause us to remember, to recall the basics of our faith. Remembering what we were taught in Sunday school or vacation Bible school or by pastors who have been here before. Those remembrances, those memories might be helpful. We don't really need, I think, so much many new things at this point. What we need is to remember and live out what we already know. Some of our biggest mistakes could well have been followed by someone saying, you knew better, didn't you? Yes, I knew better, but I just forgot. And at that point, we do forget. And so some things to remember may steer us back on a better path. Among the early Christians, you know, there was a word that many of them used to describe a person who was lost. Lost from God, lost from relationships, lost from fellowship, lost from knowing themselves. And the word in the Greek language was the word amnesia. Amnesia. We use that word sometimes today when we know somebody who's very forgetful. Forget where you are from, forget who you are, forget whose you are, forget where you belong, forget what life is about. Just forget. That was a word in the New Testament for those who were lost. It's a very good definition, I think. And so I want in these 4 sermons to remind us of what we already know so that we don't get lost. Some things to remember. Some things to... So where should we begin? Where are you going to start, Stephen? Well, I don't know. Where should we start? So maybe you start at the beginning with a conversation about the Christian people or the church. Maybe you start at the beginning with a conversation about the nature of the Bible. Maybe we start with God. That's a pretty big one, easy to track down. Do we start with Jesus Christ or the Trinity or the Holy Spirit? Where do we start with some things to remember? Maybe some of you think we should start with the reality of human sin. Maybe that's where we should start. Or maybe repentance, a cleaning the slate and a starting over again. Maybe we start with trusting God. There's a lot of possible places to start. But what's the very first thing you need to remember about the Christian life, about following Jesus Christ, about being a disciple of Jesus? What's the very first thing? Like if you were making a cake. What's the first thing when it goes into making a cake? Or if you were building a house, what's the first thing? If you're starting a conversation about the Christian life and discipleship, what's the first thing? Well, I had to make a judgment. I had to make a choice. And because I get to be here every Sunday, I get to make the choice. I had to make the call, made a decision, and it's embedded in the passage of Scripture that Jerry is going to read now for us from Isaiah chapter 6.
I'm glad you didn't forget me, anyway. Before I read this, I just want to say that I'm not a big country western fan, but when Joel and Gene were singing, I could feel it. It was good. I really appreciate it. Okay, let's get down to the Isaiah 6, verses 1 through 8. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw also the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. And above it stood the seraphims. Each one had 6 wings. With one he covered his face, and twain he covered his feet, and with twain he did fly. And one cried unto another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the post of the door moved at the voice of him that cried, and the house was filled with smoke. Then I said, Woe is me, for I am undone. I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then flew one of the seraphims into me, having a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from off the altar. And he laid it upon my mouth and said, Lo, this has touched thy lips, and thine iniquity is taken away, and thy sin purged. Also I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then I said, Here am I, send me.
Here's the historical setting for what Jerry just read. The king, whose name was Uzziah, you remember Israel had a long string of kings throughout its independence and that time in history. This king's name was Uzziah, and he had died. And a young relative of his, perhaps a cousin or a nephew, later to become a prophet, was very distraught over the death of his relative and what that death of this king would mean for himself and for his nation and for his people and for their history get together. What was this nephew going to do, soon to be the prophet Isaiah? Well, there's nothing really you can do, when there's a death in the family. It's one of those things where time seems to stand still. You may wander around a little bit, talk about the weather, talk to some friends, spend some time alone, kick a rock down the road. Well, he was kicking a rock down the road, I think, and he stumbled into the streets of Jerusalem, and he found himself in front of the temple. And he went into the temple. I don't know, probably he did not know what he was looking for, or what was going to happen, or what he was expecting there. But there in the temple, as he just sat, I imagine, he was open to whatever God had for him that day in that morning, M-O-U-R, in that morning setting. And out of that situation came this most extraordinary experience with God. A sense came over Isaiah about what was sacred. A new respect came into his life for the things of God. The sense of the sacred opened up to him in that place of mourning. The voice of God was heard in new, refreshing, challenging ways. Now let me explain. This is my starting point. This, I think, is the starting point for all discipleship. A sense of respect. A sense of reverence among the places and the events that belong to God. Here's a sense of knowing that someone is present here more important than I am. I think that's the place where it all begins. Now, I know you probably know yourself some people who just seem to have no respect whatsoever for the places and the moments that are filled with the presence of God. I think I've known some of those people, and I do reluctantly report some examples to you this morning of what I'm talking about. Experience number one. I saw a carload of young people one day following behind a passing funeral procession. The first car of the procession was the hearse, and it contained the body of the deceased. And the next car was carrying immediate family, and then a string of cars carrying relatives and friends on their way to the cemetery. Well, the young people grew impatient following this slow funeral procession. So the driver of their car just clamped down on his horn as loud as he could. And he passed the entire procession with the horn blaring, right out in front of the hearse, weaving in and out, in front of the, right there along the road. It broke my heart. That loud horn passing a funeral procession. Now, logically, you could say, I know you could say, well, the person was dead, and they were going slow, and kids had some place to be. But the point for me was, where was the respect? Where was the sense of the sacred in their lives? Example number two. I wasn't there. Someone told me about this one. It happened in Strasbourg, Austria. There in Strasbourg, some of you may know this and have been there, there's preserved in the home of Wolfgang Mozart, one of the great composers and musicians of all time, there's preserved in that home for visitors and tourists to see, but roped off by a velvet rope, the piano that Mozart played. A beautiful instrument on display right there behind a velvet rope. A little sign, very nicely written, "Do not touch the piano." Well, some American tourists were there, and they were looking at the home, and they were touring the home, and they were looking at the piano, and then one of the American tourists, guess what? Stepped over the velvet rope, and there was no guard around, and he sat down at the piano, and he began to play. Now, shouldn't we just say, Steve, a piano is a piano is a piano? No, I don't think so. My goodness. This was Mozart's piano. Think of the creative events that happened at that keyboard. Here it is roped off from a bustling public with a velvet rope sign, "Please do not touch." But here's someone over the rope, seated on the stool, playing, I don't know what, some kind of jazz maybe. Something is missing in that behavior. It's a sense of reverence for something important that approaches the sacred. Experience number 3. This one is a little more painful for me because I was there, and it involved a place of worship. There had been a young people's retreat, about 200 high schoolers, and the retreat concluded with a service of worship. And it was out in the open, kind of an open-air retreat center, and they had fixed and established a sacred place there in the meadow, in the yard. And the place contained a Bible and a table with a couple of candles on it. And as part of the service, the young people had moved forward, And they had opened the Bible, and they had lit the candles, and the service proceeded. Well, when the service was over and the parents came to pick up their children, to take them home from the retreat, the candles were left burning. And the man who had come, apparently had come to pick up his son or daughter, was standing there near the table, near the altar, near the communion table, and he pulled out a pack of cigarettes. And he pounded the pack in his hand, and he selected one of the sticks out of it, and then he picked up one of the candles from the communion table and lit his cigarette. Now, I know a candle is a candle and a flame is a flame, fire is fire, and the service was over and the people were dispelling, but still don't you feel something was violated? That the man had somehow stepped over the velvet rope in that setting. One more. This one's painful too. I was to go out to a rural church and preach one Sunday as the guest preacher. And they had a terrible rainstorm that Sunday morning, and the roads were unpaved up in central Texas, I believe, and short on gravel and long on mud. And I like to keep my appointments, so I had left early, and through the rain and over the rutted roads, I bounced around, and I finally found that little country church. Well, they had decided, while I was bouncing around in the ruts on the way out there, to cancel the service. And they called everyone but me. And that's okay, you know. Mistakes are made, accidents happen. I had left extra early, you know, and I won't tell you when it was before cell phones. And I was just unable to be reached, and so that just happened. And they knew it, and they knew that I didn't know, so they posted a couple of sentinels at the church to tell me when I arrived that the service had been canceled. Well, I walked into the sanctuary, and these two sentinels were sitting there at the communion table at the front of the sanctuary. And they were playing a game of cards on the communion table. On the table that has written on the front of it, "In remembrance of me." They were playing cards. Now, there was no money involved, and I don't know, gin rummy or pinochle or hearts or something. And I know a table is a table is a table, made out of wood and made by some carpenters years ago. And I didn't say anything to the guys about it, but my heart sank when I saw them. They'd stepped over the line, don't you think? So what I'm talking about is this. The beginning point of all conversation about religion and spirituality, especially Christian religion and Christian spirituality, is this deep, almost innate sense of reverence. To be open to the possibility of the presence of God in this place and in any place God chooses to reveal God's self. To be open. If that reverence isn't there, what good are you doing with all of the talking and all of the rituals and all of the trappings of religion? If that reverence isn't there, if it's missing, it seems to me that it's like trying to build a house on sand without that reverence. Now, I'm pleased to report that I have, and you have too, I suppose, many experiences that were just the opposite of the examples I gave. Experiences in which the people who were present had a real deep sense, as vague as it may seem, a real sense of the sacred. That something holy, something completely different than the norm was happening there. When Annie and I lived in Fort Worth in the early 1980s, we made a few trips to Dallas, you know. One day we went to downtown Dallas in search of the route. You know what route I'm talking about, don't you? In search of the route that President Kennedy had traveled on that November morning in 1963. We traced the route in our car And then we parked and began walking in the area known as Dealey Plaza. You've probably been there. There's a park there and a monument, some benches. And that day we were about 100 in number there in Dealey Plaza, strolling around the grounds. It was quiet. Among the bustling traffic of downtown Dallas, it was quiet. It was a quiet refuge place. Flowers had been laid at the base of the monument. We read the inscriptions with interest in silence. You see, we knew, the 100 of us who were there, we all knew that you don't behave here like you behave at a ball game. And in the reverence, there was quiet. There was quite a bit of quiet reverence. The Lord is in His holy temple. Let all the earth keep silent before Him. You see? The sense of awe. It becomes both awesome, and if you stay long enough, like Isaiah did, it becomes awful. I've had the same experience watching children when they are in the presence of older adults, some of whom, the older adults, have suffered a great deal. And have you ever noticed it? Have you ever watched? If you aren't in the habit of watching children, you need to develop that. It's a profound spiritual discipline to watch children. Here's an elderly person who's been through a great deal. Struggle, terrible pain, suffering, loss. And it shows in their body, it shows in their face, especially in their eyes. You can see children come around, don't they? And they grow quiet. They may not know why, but there's a sense of respect, a reverence, a holiness, which is the fundamental raw material out of which your spiritual life must grow. I experienced it profoundly. It's been about 5 years ago now, sitting on the front porch of a nursing home. I didn't know the man's name sitting beside me. Annie was inside visiting 25 people. I got tired of visiting 3 and went outside on the front porch. Annie was making friends with everybody from the custodian to the manager of the nursing home. I'd had enough of that. I was going outside, sit on the front porch, sat down beside a man, didn't even know his name. He was in a wheelchair, you know, and he had on those long white stockings. Made him look kind of like an old ballerina. And I just sat down next to him. Several minutes passed. He finally said, "I was in the first wave." I waited. He continued, "I was in the first wave at Iwo Jima. The black sand was so thick we could barely stand in it, and we like to never figured out how to run in it." I waited. They were ready for us. It makes you wonder why I made it and the guy on the other side of me never got off the beach. "How did you make it?" I whispered. "Well, my best buddy was right ahead of me, and I saw his arm get blowed off. He went down like a rock. When I got to him, I picked him up and headed back to the shore, and that's all I remember." I waited. Next thing I know, I woke up on a ship a week later. 60 years have passed, and I still don't know what happened to my buddy that day. We sat. The sun sat. I got up to leave, and I said, "Well, I appreciate you. Thank you. I appreciate you." The respect of one generation for the previous generation is a sacred thing. In reverence, there is gratitude. And in gratitude, there is reverence. Scott Momaday is one of my favorite authors. If you don't know him, I'd recommend him to you. I remember reading the account written by Scott Momaday. After he had grown up, he wrote about his school routine as a youngster. Now, Scott Momaday is a Kiowa Indian. And he told about his visit to his grandmother's house when he was a boy. He grew up on the reservation outside of Fort Sill, Oklahoma. He said his grandmother's house was his fortress, his refuge, his storehouse. He always stopped there after school to get jam and jelly sandwiches or to visit with her and let her take him on her lap and comfort him after he'd had a difficult day at school. Every afternoon it was the same. He said, to crawl into my grandmother's lap and eat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich was like a new life for me. One afternoon, however, he was late getting there. He had been detained at school, and it was almost dark when he arrived. He went into the kitchen like he always did, and the door was open. And he yelled, "Gram, Gram, Gram," and there was no answer. He called out again, "Gram," no answer. Where could she be? He started into the other room. Her little house only had 2 rooms. He started into the other room, and as he stepped across the threshold into the other room, he saw her. The kerosene lamp was already lighting the room as dusk fell. She was at the foot of the bed, bowing and lifting her arms and bowing her body in prayer. She was praying to God in the Kiowa language, and the shadow of her body on that kerosene-lit wall, with her arms falling and raising again. He said, I stopped. I chilled. And I said to myself, I have no right to go into this room. And he backed away into the other room. Do you feel what I felt? I have no right to be here. Reverence. A woman in prayer. The holy. You probably know some people who carry reverence with them like a quarter or a penny. I get the impression that in some people's heart there is just an altar of the soul. The way they speak, the way they relate, the way they smile, the way they pause, the way they are silent. There is a reverence that envelops their life and attracts people to them, because our culture does not value in any way reverence, awe. Now, being reverent is not the same as being religious. It's not the same. I hope you got that. You can tell the difference between somebody who's religious and somebody who's reverent. You know, religious people piping verses like religious mottos, talking like they just swallowed a communion table. I mean a normal life. Built on a sense of respect. Built on a sense that the sacred is real and important. This, in my judgment, is where it all begins. To be arrested by the reality that we are God's house. That we are God's house. That you are God's house. Let us proceed from here.